February 17, 1944. The dawn sky above Truk Lagoon looked like molten silver, the kind that shimmered over calm Pacific waters before the world decided to burn. To the men stationed there, Japanese sailors, ground crews, and pilots, the morning began as any other, humidity thick as soup, the smell of aviation fuel biting through the mist, and the faint hum of generators pulsing beneath the tropical stillness. Then someone shouted. On the horizon, dots began to multiply, dark shapes against the gold sky. At first, they thought it was just another patrol returning. But the dots kept coming, 20, 50, then hundreds, until the very air seemed to vibrate with a low, mechanical roar. It was not a patrol. It was an invasion from the clouds. The first Japanese officer to identify the threat was Lieutenant Keiichi Arima, a veteran Zero pilot with years of service carved into the lines on his face. He had been stationed at Truk since the early days of the war, when Japan ruled the skies. To him, the Zero was a work of art, light, elegant, and deadly in skilled hands. He had danced through dogfights with a kind of reverence, believing the plane's agility was an extension of his spirit. But this morning, as he squinted toward the horizon, that faith wavered. The shapes in the distance were thicker, heavier, and faster than anything he had seen before. They didn't glide, they surged. Hellcats, someone muttered beside him. The words sounded foreign, mechanical, and monstrous. Thousands of feet above, another man, Lieutenant J.G. David McCampbell of the U.S. Navy, was adjusting the oxygen mask on his face. Below him, the turquoise of the Pacific was broken by the dark reefs of Truk, Japan's so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific. The mission brief had been simple: neutralize the airfields, sink the fleet, cripple the enemy's nerve center. But McCampbell's eyes weren't on the ships. He was scanning the sky, waiting for the counterattack he knew was coming. His Hellcat, a Grumman F6F vibrated with restrained power. He often joked that it felt less like flying and more like riding a bulldozer with wings. Still, he loved the machine. It could take punishment that would tear another plane apart, and it could dish out more than enough in return. He tapped the side of his cockpit affectionately. "Let's see what you can do, girl." For 2 years, Japanese pilots had dominated the Pacific. In 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was a symbol of divine precision. It could outturn, outclimb, and outfight almost anything the Allies put against it. Early American aviators whispered about it like a ghost, silent, deadly, and impossible to hit. But by 1943, the tide had shifted. The U.S. had learned from its disasters. Engineers back home in Bethpage, Long Island, worked like possessed men in the Grumman factory, nicknamed the Iron Works, because their planes simply refused to die. Their creation, the F6F Hellcat, was heavier, stronger, and brutally simple to maintain. The Navy didn't just want a fighter, it wanted a fortress with wings. And in less than a year, the Hellcat was rolling off production lines by the hundreds. As the American formation neared Truk, McCampbell felt the tightness in his gut that always came before combat. The call crackled through his headset: enemy aircraft, 11 o'clock high. He looked up just in time to see the faint glint of sunlight on the wings of approaching Zeros. They were climbing fast, dozens of them. "Here we go," he muttered. Engines roared as the two formations closed the gap between them, the distance shrinking in seconds. The first tracers ripped through the sky, red and green streaks crossing like fireworks gone wrong. McCampbell dove, pulling into a wide arc that sent his Hellcat screaming through the cloud bank. A Zero latched onto his tail, guns spitting. Bullets slammed into the fuselage, punching holes through the metal skin. But the Hellcat barely shuddered. McCampbell flipped over, throttled forward, and pulled a vertical climb that left the Japanese pilot spinning out beneath him. The American turned sharply, lined up the target, and fired. A burst of .50 caliber rounds struck the Zero mid-fuselage. It didn't explode, it simply disintegrated in midair. On the ground, Arima watched in disbelief as the dogfights unfolded above him. The Hellcats didn't move like the nimble Zeros, they seemed to power through the air by sheer will. He scrambled to his own fighter, pulling on his leather helmet as mechanics shouted over the noise. "You can't take off, runways are under fire." someone yelled. He ignored them. The world around him was chaos, bombs falling, smoke plumes rising from ships in the harbor, and the sky filled with the growl of engines. When he finally lifted off, the heat of the burning airfield shimmered beneath his wings. He climbed toward the melee, adrenaline surging, heart pounding with equal parts fear and pride. The first Hellcat he faced looked impossibly large, its radial engine gleaming like polished armor. Arima turned sharply, trying to force it into a turning fight, a tactic that had always worked before. But the American didn't turn. Instead, it climbed, then dropped straight down like a hammer. Arima jerked his control stick, but it was too late. The Hellcat's bullets ripped through his tail assembly. His plane shuddered violently, smoke pouring from the engine. Somehow, he leveled out and escaped into the clouds. Above him, McCampbell saw the crippled Zero spiral away but didn't chase. He had been taught not to waste fuel on wounded prey. There were too many targets, and the priority was control of the skies. His radio buzzed with chatter, 2 more down, 1 diving toward the bay. The Hellcats were everywhere now, rolling, climbing, diving with mechanical precision. It was less a battle than a storm, and the Japanese were caught in it. For every American plane hit, 5 Japanese went down in flames. McCampbell caught sight of a formation of bombers below and watched as the Hellcats cleared the skies above them like shepherds guarding a flock. "Unbelievable," he whispered, half to himself. By late morning, Truk Lagoon was unrecognizable. The once proud anchorage of the Imperial Japanese Navy was burning, its runways cratered, its ships sinking in oily plumes. Arima landed on what remained of a side strip, the wheels skidding over debris. He climbed out, trembling. His once immaculate uniform was soaked with sweat, his ears ringing from the engine noise. Around him, the air smelled of salt, smoke, and defeat. He looked up again, at the endless stream of American aircraft still arriving from the carriers beyond the horizon. The realization struck him cold. Japan no longer ruled the skies. Far above, McCampbell leveled out at cruising altitude, checking his instruments. The radio chatter was calming now, orders being relayed, mission updates, calm voices where chaos had been. He exhaled, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. His Hellcat bore a dozen bullet holes, 1 wing tip singed, but it still purred like an animal eager for more. He thought briefly of the pilots below, their courage, their futility, and felt a strange pang of respect. "They're good," he admitted quietly. "But not even the best can fight a wall." He glanced once more at the horizon, where smoke still rose in thin black pillars. In that moment, he understood what the war had become, not a contest of skill, but of endurance. Below, Arima stood beside his wounded Zero as the smoke thickened. He watched another formation of Hellcats roar overhead, their shadows sliding across the wrecked airfield like moving tombstones. The sound was deafening, endless. And for the first time, he felt something he had never felt before, not anger, not fear, but awe. The enemy had built a machine that could not be stopped. The flying wall, his comrades would later call it. But in that moment, he just called it what it was, the end of the old sky. By mid-1943, the Pacific skies had become an enormous chessboard of steel and smoke, and both sides were learning, painfully, that dominance there depended not only on courage but on machinery. The Imperial Japanese Navy had once ruled those blue expanses with the A6M0, a sleek, nimble marvel that danced through dogfights with impossible grace. But by the summer of '43, the dance had grown desperate. The Zero's wings still cut the clouds like knives, but its armor was thin, its engine underpowered, and its pilots, once the finest in the world, were being replaced by boys barely old enough to shave. America, on the other hand, had been quietly learning. It had studied defeat, recorded every weakness, and was now ready to return the favor. From the humming hangars of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Long Island rolled a new machine, broad-shouldered, thick-skinned, and brutally efficient. They called it the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was the opposite of the Zero in every way. It wasn't elegant, it was purposeful. Where the Zero relied on agility, the Hellcat relied on strength. Its fuselage was so tough that one Navy pilot joked, If you hit a Hellcat, you just made it mad. Its wingspan stretched over 42 feet, carrying 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each one capable of shredding through the aluminum frame of an enemy aircraft in seconds. Beneath its rugged frame purred the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a twin-row radial beast that gave the Hellcat nearly 2,000 horsepower. It was an aircraft built by engineers who had no interest in glory. They were building a flying anvil, a wall that could take hits and keep moving forward. Among the first men to fly the new beast was Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell, a farm boy from Iowa who had once believed he'd spend his life mending fences and flying crop dusters. Instead, he now found himself aboard the USS Essex, feeling the deck vibrate beneath his boots as Hellcats lined up like metallic predators. Caldwell had flown Wildcats before, Grumman's earlier fighter, but he knew the Hellcat was something else. It was bigger, heavier, and far more forgiving. "She's like a steel angel," he told his wingman, a grinning Texan named Hank Rivers. "She may not dance, but she sure can fight." Far across the Pacific, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kato of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat beneath a tattered canvas awning on the island of Truk, sipping lukewarm tea and staring at a map dotted with red pins. He was 28, older than most of his squadron, and had survived over 60 aerial engagements. His Zero bore the scars of those encounters: patched holes, scorched paint, and a slight vibration in the left wing that refused to go away. The younger pilots revered him, but Kato carried his experience like a stone in his chest. He had seen too many friends vanish into the sea, swallowed by fire and water. He believed in honor, in skill, in the art of aerial combat. But lately that art was dying. America's machines were getting faster, stronger. He could sense a shift in the air, something heavy and inevitable. The first time Kato's squadron encountered the Hellcat, it was just after dawn over the Marshall Islands. The sun rose red over the ocean as a formation of Hellcats escorted dive bombers toward Japanese positions. Kato and his men dove from the clouds, confident, screaming into their radios, "Tatsugiki, attack!" The Zeros sliced down in perfect formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. But what they met wasn't chaos, it was a wall. The Hellcats didn't scatter or turn away. They tightened formation, absorbed the attack, and fired back in perfect discipline. Kato watched in disbelief as one of his wingmen riddled a Hellcat with cannon fire, yet the American plane kept flying, engines roaring like thunder. Then, in seconds, the Hellcat rolled over, its machine guns lighting up the dawn. Kato saw tracers tear through his wingman's fuselage. The Zero erupted into flame, spiraling down. Kato pulled up sharply, sweat stinging his eyes. The Hellcat's silhouette followed, implacable. "It's like fighting a mountain," he muttered later, his voice hollow. On the USS Essex, Jimmy Caldwell didn't think of himself as invincible. He knew too many ways the sky could kill a man. But after that battle, he understood what the engineers back home had done. The Hellcat could take punishment no other plane could survive. Caldwell's windshield was spiderwebbed from enemy fire, his wing pocked with holes, but he'd made it back. Hank Rivers slapped him on the shoulder and laughed. "Hellcat? More like Hell's bulldog." Their laughter wasn't arrogance, it was relief. They had finally stopped being the underdogs. The shift in the Pacific Air War wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. For the first time, American pilots felt that their survival didn't depend solely on luck or maneuvering skill. They could fight on even terms. The Navy's flight instructors noticed it too. New pilots returned from missions alive, confident. Reports from the front poured in. By the end of 1943, the Hellcat's kill ratio against the Zero was already approaching 13-1. It was staggering. Statisticians back at Pearl Harbor didn't believe it at first, but the combat reports were undeniable. Kato, meanwhile, faced a cruel arithmetic of his own. Each week, new recruits arrived, barely trained, their eyes too wide, their hands trembling as they gripped their flight sticks. They were eager, patriotic, and doomed. The Imperial Navy had lost too many veterans, and fuel shortages meant that training flights were often limited to a few hours. When he looked into the faces of his squadron, Kato saw ghosts in waiting. "We are not soldiers anymore," he confided to his mechanic one night. "We are offerings, Yet when the order came to fly, he went without hesitation. The war in the Pacific was evolving faster than anyone could comprehend. The Americans were building carriers faster than the Japanese could sink them. The sky, once Japan's domain, was now becoming a proving ground for American industry. Every Hellcat that roared off a carrier deck carried not just bullets, but the weight of factories, welders, riveters, an entire nation learning how to fight smarter. In one rare moment of dark humor, Caldwell wrote home to his sister, "If you ever see a Hellcat in a museum, pat her on the nose for me. She's got more fight in her than most men I know." His words captured what the statistics couldn't, the transformation of spirit. The men weren't just flying machines, they were flying proof that the tide could turn. By the end of 1943, word of the Hellcat had spread across the Pacific like legend. Japanese pilots began calling it the Flying Wall, a name born of frustration and awe. Kato heard the phrase whispered in his camp and said nothing. He merely looked toward the horizon, where thunderclouds gathered, and muttered to himself, "A wall can be climbed, or it can fall on you." But even as he spoke, he knew this was a different kind of wall, one that moved, struck, and never seemed to break. And somewhere beyond those clouds, Caldwell and his squadron climbed once more into their Hellcats, engines howling like defiance. The war had changed, and the sky would never be the same again. By early 1944, the Pacific had become a theater of attrition, a contest not merely of courage but of endurance. For men like Jimmy Caldwell and Hiroshi Kato, every sortie was a test of willpower against exhaustion, hope against inevitability. The once glorious duels of agility and grace had given way to brutal, grinding engagements where survival was decided less by who flew better and more by who flew the right machine. The Hellcat had reshaped the rules, and the Zero pilots were beginning to realize that honor was no longer armor. On February 16, 1944, before dawn touched the ocean, Caldwell stood on the carrier deck of the USS Bunker Hill as the crew prepared for Operation Hailstone, a massive assault on Truk Lagoon, the heart of Japan's Pacific stronghold. The horizon glowed faintly orange, the smell of fuel and salt mingling with anticipation. Around him, Hellcats lined up like steel beasts waiting for release. Over 500 American planes would strike that day, a symphony of destruction composed in Detroit, welded in Long Island, and conducted from the decks of carriers spread across the sea. Caldwell pulled on his helmet, his hands steady but his stomach uneasy. He knew the sky would be thick with fire by noon. Inside his cockpit, he touched the photograph taped beside his altimeter, his sister back home in Iowa, smiling in front of their family's red barn. It was a small ritual, something to remind him of what all this noise and chaos was supposed to protect. As the launch signal came, he throttled forward. The deck vanished beneath him, replaced by roaring blue. The Hellcat climbed easily, its engine steady, almost reassuring. Around him, the formation formed into tight lines, wings glinting under the rising sun. Ahead lay Truk, a fortress ringed by anti-aircraft guns and patrolled by dozens of Japanese fighters. On the other side of that same horizon, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kato was already in the air, his Zero leading a ragged squadron of 15 planes. He had received the warning only an hour earlier, enemy carriers approaching from the northeast. The fuel supply at Truk was dangerously low, but retreat wasn't an option. "We fight," the commander had said, his voice grim but proud. Kato didn't argue. He simply climbed into his cockpit, feeling the old machine tremble beneath him as though sharing his exhaustion. As they rose through the cloud layer, he could see the vast shadow of the American strike group spreading below like a moving continent. His men followed, most of them too young to grasp what they were flying into. The first wave met at 10,000 feet. Caldwell spotted them first, thin-winged silhouettes diving from the sun. "Zeros, 11 o'clock high," he shouted over the radio, and instantly, the formation scattered into combat groups. The sky erupted into chaos. Tracers streaked like meteors. Caldwell pulled hard left as 2 Zeros cut across his tail. He felt the rattle of bullets against his fuselage but kept his throttle open. The Hellcat responded like a living thing, rolling into a climbing turn that no Zero could match. Behind him, Hank Rivers' voice crackled over the radio. "Got one on your 6, Jimmy. Hang tight. A burst of machine gun fire flashed past Caldwell's canopy. Then came the deeper roar of Hank's guns. One of the pursuing Zeros exploded into a cloud of flame and debris. Cato saw the explosion from a distance and felt the familiar chill of loss. He pushed his plane into a steep dive, closing in on a pair of Hellcats strafing ground positions. His fingers were steady as he lined up the shot. He squeezed the trigger, watching his cannon spit fire. For a moment, the rounds found their mark. He saw sparks dance along a Hellcat's wing. But instead of falling, the American fighter banked hard and came back around, its 6 Brownings roaring like a hurricane. Cato yanked his stick, the G-force crushing him against the seat. Bullets tore through his tail assembly, smoke curling around his canopy. He managed to level out, heart pounding, the smell of fuel thick in the cockpit. "They don't die," he muttered under his breath. "They just won't die." Meanwhile, Caldwell dove through the melee, chasing a fleeing Zero that darted low over the lagoon. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from ships below, black puffs bursting all around. The Hellcat shuddered but kept pace. He squeezed the trigger, short, controlled bursts. Tracers found the target, and the Zero's wing detached in a burst of fire. Caldwell watched it crash into the water, then pulled up sharply, lungs burning. There was no satisfaction in the kill, only a deep, dull fatigue. He looked around. The air was filled with burning wreckage, spiraling chutes, and the faint echoes of men shouting through radios. By the end of that day, Truck Lagoon was a graveyard. Over 250 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground, and dozens of ships smoldered in the harbor. American losses were minimal. The Hellcats returned to their carriers battered but intact. Caldwell landed with his left wing punctured and oil leaking across the fuselage. He climbed out of the cockpit, drenched in sweat, his face streaked with soot. Around him, deck crews cheered the returning pilots, but he could barely hear them. He only saw the ocean stretching endlessly, dotted with the rising smoke of a dying empire. Cato limped his crippled Zero back toward the island, the engine coughing with each mile. When he finally touched down on a cratered runway, the left gear collapsed, sending the plane skidding sideways in a shower of dust. He crawled out, clutching his burned arm. Around him lay the shattered remains of his squadron. Some had never returned, others burned where they'd landed. For the first time, Cato felt something heavier than grief. He felt futility. The war that had once promised glory now offered only endurance. That night, under the flickering light of a camp lantern, he wrote in his journal, "The Americans have built a machine that does not fear death. Their pilots fight as if their wings cannot break. Ours fight as if our souls cannot escape." He paused, listening to the distant rumble of bombs falling somewhere beyond the horizon. He wondered if courage still meant anything when the sky itself seemed invincible. On the USS Bunker Hill, Caldwell sat in the mess hall, silent as his fellow pilots swapped stories of near misses and lucky shots. Hank nudged him, offering a tin mug of coffee. "You thinking about home again?" Caldwell smiled faintly. "No. Thinking about them." He nodded toward the dark sea outside the porthole. "They're fighting with everything they've got, and still, it's like we're flying different wars." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same ocean that separated Iowa from Japan now united their destinies in smoke and thunder. Both sides had men who dreamed, feared, and prayed. The machines between them had simply rewritten what bravery looked like. The Hellcat had not only changed battles, it had changed men. It turned ordinary pilots into survivors, and in doing so, stripped away the romance of air combat. As the carrier fleet turned homeward, the Pacific night stretched endless and black. Caldwell stood on deck, feeling the wind cut across his face. Somewhere beyond that darkness, Cato stared up at the same sky, his body aching, his faith shaken. Neither man knew the other's name, yet each carried the same quiet truth, that war was no longer about who flew better, but who endured longer. And somewhere between their separate silences, the world was shifting toward its inevitable reckoning. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea was a flat mirror of blue, endless and deceptive in its calm. The morning light shimmered across the carrier decks like molten silver as American crews moved in a disciplined frenzy, refueling, arming, shouting orders that vanished into the rising roar of engines. The operation was codenamed Forager, but everyone knew what it really was: a showdown. The Japanese combined fleet was coming, desperate to stop the American advance toward the Marianas. It would become known, in time, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for men like Lieutenant Jimmy Caldwell, standing by his Hellcat with gloved hands clenched and nerves wound tight, it was not history yet. It was the day everything came to a head. Across that same vast expanse, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kato prepared for what he sensed might be his final mission. He had slept little the night before, haunted by the silence that followed every battle. Truk was gone, Rabaul a ruin, and now the Imperial Navy was gambling its last reserves of trained pilots and fuel on one decisive strike. Kato's squadron was smaller than ever, barely 10 planes, many piloted by young boys who looked more like students than soldiers. They laughed nervously as they tightened their flight harnesses, pretending not to see the fear in one another's eyes. Kato moved among them, offering quiet encouragement. "Remember your training," he said softly. "Stay with your wingmen. And whatever happens, fly with honor." He did not tell them that honor no longer won wars. At 10:23 a.m., radar operators aboard the USS Lexington reported incoming bogies, dozens, then hundreds. The enemy had launched everything. Within minutes, the sky began to fill with the unmistakable hum of war. Caldwell climbed into his cockpit, the steel of the Hellcat warm from the morning sun. As the launch officer gave the signal, he throttled forward. The carrier deck blurred beneath him, and suddenly the world was all wind, cloud, and anticipation. His wingman, Hank Rivers, formed up beside him, his grin audible even through the static. "Let's go bag some bandits, Jimmy." Caldwell smirked but said nothing. He'd seen too many men make jokes before vanishing into smoke. The first contact came fast. The Japanese formation appeared on the horizon, a dark swarm, glittering in the sunlight. Caldwell counted more than he could track. "All Hellcats, engage at will," came the command through the radio. Then the air shattered. Zeros dove in waves, guns blazing, engines screaming. But the Hellcats were ready. Caldwell yanked his stick, climbing sharply, rolling over into a dive that put him directly behind 2 enemy fighters. He fired in short, brutal bursts. The tracers lanced through both planes, which burst into fireballs that tumbled into the sea. It was over in seconds, efficient, mechanical, almost impersonal. The Hellcats fought in disciplined packs, covering one another, refusing to scatter. Kato led his remaining pilots into the fray, the sun reflecting off his canopy as he banked hard to avoid tracer fire. He saw the enemy formation below, dozens of Hellcats weaving in precise, practiced movements. They were relentless, coordinated, utterly unlike the chaotic skirmishes of earlier years. His radio crackled with desperate calls. "I can't shake him. I'm hit. They're everywhere." Kato's jaw tightened. He spotted one Hellcat breaking formation and dove after it, firing in measured bursts. His round struck the tail, but the American fighter didn't go down. Instead, it pulled into a sharp climb, flipped, and came straight back at him. For a heartbeat, Kato locked eyes with the other pilot through their canopies, Caldwell. They both fired. Caldwell's tracers ripped through Kato's wing. Kato's shells grazed Caldwell's fuselage. The Hellcat shuddered, alarms flashing red. Caldwell gritted his teeth, forcing the plane to hold. The Zero rolled violently, smoke trailing from its left side. Yet somehow Kato steadied it. The duel spiraled downward, 2 fighters locked in a deadly dance above the sea. Caldwell fired again, missed, pulled up, dove again. The ocean spun below, blue and merciless. Kato's hands moved on instinct, the years of training keeping him alive a few seconds longer. Finally, Caldwell found his opening. Kato turned into a climb, slower now, his engine sputtering. Caldwell pressed the trigger one last time. The bullet struck cleanly. Kato's Zero lurched, then began to fall, trailing a plume of black smoke. Caldwell followed it down with his eyes until it vanished into the waves. For a moment, he said nothing. Hank's voice crackled through the static. "You got him, Jimmy. He's done." But Caldwell didn't feel triumph. He just felt the hollow space where adrenaline had been. Somewhere deep down, he hoped the man he'd just shot down had made it out. Cato did not. His plane hit the water at full speed, the canopy shattering on impact. For a moment, the Pacific swallowed everything: the fire, the wreckage, the sound. Then only ripples remained. Above, the sky still burned with battle. Within hours, it was over. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. The victory was staggering, decisive, and horrifying. The Japanese air arm was effectively gone. The sky belonged to the Hellcat. When Caldwell landed back on the carrier deck, the crew was cheering, waving, congratulating the pilots as heroes. The Turkey Shoot, they called it later, as if it had been sport. Caldwell forced a smile, but when he sat in the quiet of his cabin that night, the phrase made him sick. He opened his logbook, wrote down the day's statistics: sorties flown, kills recorded, losses sustained, but paused before writing the last line. Instead, he simply wrote, "The sky feels empty." Then he closed the book. In a far corner of the ocean, what was left of Cato's squadron never returned. The Imperial Navy marked them as "missing in action," a phrase that carried more mercy than truth. In the months that followed, the war moved closer to Japan's shores, carried by men and machines that refused to stop. But the legend of the Flying Wall spread even further. Captured pilots spoke of American planes that could not be brought down, of pilots who seemed protected by fate. To those who faced them, the Hellcat was not just a machine, it was inevitability in metal form. Back in Iowa, months later, Caldwell finally returned home. The farm looked smaller than he remembered, the sky wider, quieter. His sister greeted him at the gate, tears mixing with laughter. Yet as night fell, he found himself staring upward, searching for stars behind the darkness. He thought of the faces he'd seen flash past in his gun sight, of the men who had fought bravely in skies thousands of miles away. In another life, he might have shared a drink with one of them. The war would end soon, but for Caldwell, and for those like him, the end was complicated. Victory had come, yes, but it carried the weight of everything lost to achieve it. In later interviews, he never spoke of numbers or ratios. When asked what he remembered most about his time in the Hellcat, he simply said, "She got me home." That was the truth of it. The Hellcat was not beautiful, not poetic. It was a wall of steel and fire that had turned the tide of the Pacific. It was the machine that ended the age of romantic air combat and ushered in something colder, more relentless. And somewhere, in the quiet between waves, the sea still held its memories, of courage, of destruction, of men on both sides who met the sky with everything they had. As the documentary voice fades, the camera would linger on the horizon, where sunlight breaks across calm waters. If you like this story, the narrator would say gently, hit that like button, subscribe to the Forgotten War Stories, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done, staring down a flying wall? The music swells, the screen darkens, and the ocean remains, a silent witness to the day when the sky itself decided the war's fate.